And we're gonna start the 2020 affiliates meeting and workshop. We're with this Susan Reagan with New Mexico with UNM Bureau of Business and Economic Research, and I'm a coordinating agent within the State Data Center program, of which you are all affiliates with. And Ryan Eustace is actually the State Data Center lead. And I don't know if you want to say anything about being a State Data Center lead.
Hi, everyone. Susan, thank you for the beautiful introduction. Um, yeah, new to the position. I think I've been the State Data Center lead for about 2 years, but I ask a lot of Susan as I'm learning this. This is my first census, so I'm excited to kind of not only touch base, but meet everyone who is an affiliate and get some feedback. Absolutely.
All right, let's see if I can advance. There we go. So what I'm going to do is a really brief sort of PowerPoint. I want to kind of frame a little bit of a discussion with us this afternoon. The official 2020 census count is come to a conclusion, and we're all waiting for the Census Bureau to finish processing our data so that they can give it back to us and let us know how many people are now in the United States. And fresh in our mind is all the things that happened that cause a decennial census. Certainly this year is so much different from any other decennial census because of COVID-19. And even despite COVID-19, I think coming into this decennial census, there were other issues like budgets and cuts. So I want to kind of talk through those things so that we can record them. And I'm going to take notes later on so that I can sort of collect information, how you all viewed what happened, what were lessons learned, what were good things that happened, what were really difficult things to do. And eventually at the end of the PowerPoint, I want to kind of come to a discussion where we can kind of plan what do we want to do as an affiliate program to the State Data Center, how we want to plan to aim throughout the decade leading up to 2030. So let me step in. I pulled this off of one kind of notes I had, but these are all the steps of a decennial census. Between censuses, there's scientific committees that get together, and they address things like what questions will be on the decennial census, what methodologies will we be using. And I've actually personally been trying to get a couple of UNM professors nominated to some of the scientific advisory committees. As those things in the notices in the federal registers come out, I try to pass those around to people because it's during this period of time where important things are decided or put forward that impact what actually happens and what gets counted later on. So that's one part of the decennial census. The next thing is once they decide on those things, they do testing, they try out new technologies. The Census Bureau runs through a lot of different programs. Something that came up during this decennial census was the Census Bureau actually submits the questions to Congress 2 to 3 years before the decennial census. And certainly, a lot of the news covered was the president saying we're going to include the question on citizenship on the decennial census. And he actually proposed that after Congress had already approved the questions. And so we saw that play out in the media. But there's a lot of steps like the questions and stuff that really truly happened before the decennial census and is in that timeline between that maybe we could address before things like that so things don't get out of hand. A big part of what happens between one decennial census and another are geography programs, and I'm going to cover those in a bit. There's also the master address programs, and I list two, not just LUCA, but I also list building permits because I think that's an annual program that people don't realize. The Census Bureau asks every jurisdiction in New Mexico, hey, how many buildings did you have permits for this month? It's a monthly program that they ask for data from our local governments every month. And that actually impacts the master address program file, because that's how they know when there's a new building to add to their list. And Luca, of course, is that program where Robert Radigan's group, GPS, worked with the Census Bureau, and they had phenomenal success in adding lots of addresses that were not included on New Mexico's master address list that the Census Bureau had. So those are programs that impact where the forms go when the Census Bureau asks, when they send out the forms to ask us to complete our census. Another thing I think that came up really big for me this year that I didn't realize is the advertising campaign. Advertising campaign actually gets running, the funding for it, the national advertising program, the contract gets let out 2 years prior to the decennial census. And I had advertising places in New Mexico, specifically tribal areas, who suddenly reached out to me during March and February of 2020 saying, hey, we want to be part of the advertising campaign. And I was kind of like at that point saying, you missed the boat. You should have been involved in it earlier. That advertising campaign, I think when we look at the funding that we were able to roll out through the complete count committees and bring in advertising, that campaign really did huge dividends for New Mexico in September and August. Just a phenomenal amount of houses upped our response rates in those last 6 weeks. And so it may be important that we think about those advertising campaigns and prepping people who are in that industry 2 years prior to the census. Obviously, partnership program and complete count committees are a big part of getting the word out and getting people to fill out their census. Field operations is huge, but field operations doesn't really get started till like 2 years prior to the decennial census, where you have the staff hiring starting to ramp up to do the regional offices, to form the partnership programs, and all of that stuff runs really prior to 2020 or to the decade. Then you have that self-response period, you have the update leave, and in New Mexico, update leave is a huge part. We have many counties where update leave happens when you don't have a mailing address that the post office delivers mail to. They deliver to a post office box. My big example of this is Mora County. Nobody in Mora County has a mailbox in front of their house. They all go to the Mora County post office box and pick up their mail. So nobody in Mora County had a form in February or March or April of this year. And in fact, they didn't get their actual form and their request to participate in the decennial census until update leave was opened up in May, at the end of May and the beginning of June. So you look at Mora County response rates, you see that it's low. New Mexico has a high number or high percentage of update leave addresses in New Mexico, and that's a big issue for us. There's group quarters, then there's the non-response follow-up, and then the enumeration of transitory locations. All of that stuff happens during the census taking time. We're now in that post-enumeration of data processing, and we're waiting for our data. We know that there will be a delivery of apportionment data to the president, and then a delivery of redistricting products. They're different products to the redistricting commissions throughout the United States. And then redistricting happens, and then hopefully we all get our data that we get to play with. That, in a nutshell, is all the steps that it takes to do a decennial census. And you notice there's a ton of steps that happen way before we even hit the process of collecting surveys. I kind of stole this from somebody else's presentation, or it's from one of the geographic program timelines. Geography is key, and geography is one of those key things that local governments need to interact with the U.S. Census Bureau. And you can see that there are processes. BASS is an annual program, and we'll look at that in a minute. But you can see that these programs really reach out to local governments and state entities to help the Census Bureau make sure they have the right boundaries. And it's a decade-long process. It's not something that happens just the day before the Census Bureau. I was just talking about boundary and annexation survey. This is an annual program. I participate in this when, so that initially a letter goes out to the highest elected official in every jurisdiction. That's all your municipalities, your counties, and the state government. And that highest elected official tells somebody in there, hey, I need you, you have GIS. I want you to respond to this and tell the Census Bureau if we've added parcels into our, if we've added land in or we've lost land to somebody. And that happens every year. So they get a letter in December, and then a letter goes out to the actual person, the person in the governmental entity that's going to update the boundaries in January, and their deadline to respond is May 31st every year. When they don't respond, if they haven't responded to the Census Bureau by mid-March, I get the spreadsheet and I get to call everybody on the spreadsheet and say, hey, Boundary and Annexation Survey wants to know if you're going to participate this year. Have you had any? And a part of that is, if I think about it, the Census Bureau is contacting hundreds, even in the state of New Mexico, hundreds of governmental entities to keep their boundaries updated. People change jobs, so they might forget to tell the next person into the job, you know, you're going to have to answer this question. Did we add land into our stuff or not, and document it with the Census Bureau? So that's one thing. Just a note, there's BCARP, and we actually have a liaison to the geography group, to the boundary annexation, Larry Brotman with Tax and Rev, and he works with all of the counties to keep their taxation boundaries correct. He also, when he gets notified of boundary changes, he also makes sure the Census Bureau does. But sometimes he's found that he'll get boundary changes and then they don't send him to the Census Bureau, or the Census Bureau get boundary changes and he doesn't get them. And so there's some communication mismatch in there.
Susan, before you move on to the next one.
Yes.
Pauline Nunez would like to make a comment on the importance of the geography programs.
Go ahead.
Hi, Suzanne. I just didn't want to interrupt you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just wanted to say that for New Mexico, we don't have a lot of funding in the Census Bureau to promote PSAP, but I think it's just, and also BAS, how important it is to tribal nations and also rural communities. Because what happens with PSAP also, it's important, and I've done this when I've trained like the staff from the USDA, and it's like, I remember someone from Southern New Mexico say that they really understood this, the CDP program, designating something as a CDP, and how important it was, so that when they went to the USDA, they were able to get funding for their water district because they had designated as a CDP. And so the same thing with tribes, because people don't understand that the geography of a tribe, like when we look at our data, it's a reservation, but it could be like non-AIAN people living on that reservation, and you want to be able to prove that your community, your tribal community, needs the funding. And so I can't stress enough, and it was tough selling the PSAP program to tribes. So I just wanted to point that out, that anything the State Data Center can do to educate people, the tribes and rural communities, it is so important to participate in, for us to know their boundaries, because the more we know the boundaries, the more we know if they designated someone in a population area as a PSAP, the better the data, and data is dollars.
Thank you, Pauline. You know, you talked about the PSAP, and that was a slide coming up here. I just went right to it.
See, we're just thinking the same.
So we can talk about the PSAP. PSAP only happens once every decade. And that's when small geographies can ask to become a census designated place so that you can get statistics for your small area. I had a couple of places for New Mexico, and I was pleased to see in Mike Radcliffe's presentation on Wednesday morning, all the geographies, all of Doña Ana County did a phenomenal job during PSAP this year, and they were able to get almost all of their colonias listed as a CDP. An amazing amount of work happened down in the southern part of the state on that. Unfortunately, on the northern part of the state, I was trying to get Rio Arriba County to participate in PSAP and fix some data issues they have in some of their CDPs. And there were 2 areas in northern New Mexico who wanted to be CDPs. I have not yet seen if they actually got them. I think one of them did for sure. And I think the other one was too late to the game. So we're going to see what we can do for them on down the line here. But I also know that I was trying to get another governmental entity to step in and work with Raton, because Raton, the city of Raton, felt that their boundaries are not correct. And they were trying to correct that during PSAP, but I don't think they realized they really needed to correct that during the BAS program. So certainly there's a lot of confusion because there are different programs around geography, and it's our local governments, and that includes tribal governments, that when these letters to the highest elected official come in, they really need to actually put somebody in charge. So PSAP's an important program. And then the other one, I talked briefly earlier about Luca. I thought we had a phenomenal job done in Luca. And that's our last chance, or that's our big chance to make sure that the census master address file is correct, and they'll send out a form to every address that's in their file. And again, during the 2016, and this is something else to talk about, there's an initial outreach to the highest elected officials, i.e. our governors, to designate for the state an official LUCA liaison for the state to do this. And if it's not done during that process, then we're already behind in trying to get the programs up and running. Okay, just to kind of iterate all the activities just before, during, and after census data, in 2018, there was an end-to-end test that was, I think that was the Rhode Island test, and it was scaled down because of funding. There's the 2020 census questions were sent to Congress by March 31st in 2018. You can see that the 6 regional census offices and the 40 area offices were set to open in 2018, and our local offices didn't open up until early 2020. And Pauline could probably address the exact date, but I don't remember. So many of these things that happened 2 years before the decennial census were actually delayed coming into 2020. So even without COVID, I think that the 2020 census had a lot of things to overcome. You can see in 2019, you're trying to put up your partnership activities, your partnership specialists are hired, your complete count committees start forming. And then, as you head into 2020, you have the census data, the date. We've been through all of that, and now we're into that post census taking and waiting for the census processing of our data to give us our data products. Let's do a little bit of talk about census redistricting. It's a multi-stage program. It actually starts with a geographic verifying of census blocks and boundaries. And that process actually it's not political. There's a lot of rules on this is what a block looks like. This is how you can define a block, and a block can't be split in half. So once you define those blocks, your census tracts and your voting districts are all based off of those small blocks. That process goes through LFC in New Mexico, by the way. Note that redistricting is not apportionment redistricting. And census redistricting data offices are coordinated through the census redistricting liaison. And like I mentioned, that's actually in New Mexico out of the LFC. And then local areas are invited to review and provide feedback. And you know what? Voting district review actually began in 2018. So as we get our data, our voting districting stuff is already kind of there. And people think that we're going to go draw those shapes automatically. As they review the redistricting and the new data, and I don't have anything to do with this, so I'm just going to say I don't know all of the little bits and pieces on this. But that block boundary stuff that our voting districts are going to be based on has already been completed. And then we'll go through that redistricting phase next year with the legislature. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. And I don't think people realize that redistricting is this sort of long process that really is based on geography. The next big geography program that's coming up, and it's going to start in September 2020, that I'm much more interested in at this point. And it is actually a program that state data centers get to be a part of. We get to review the public use micro area geographies that we get our public use micro sample data for. So any of you who have used the PUMAs to do research, this is an important program for us, because next fall I'm going to come to you guys. I'm going to say, all right, Ryan and I looked at the PUMA suggestions that the Census Bureau sent to us, and we're thinking about redrawing these PUMAs for our data to do our research on that micro sample file. And we're going to ask you to look at it and see if it makes sense. So just a heads up, that's a program that's coming up, and that's public use micro areas. Yes.
Just for clarification, it says September 2020. Is it September 2021?
It's September 2021. That's a typo.
That is my apologies too. Thank you, Louis, for pointing that out.
Yeah, that'll be next fall. So at the census level, 2030 census planning has already started. There's a document, and I'm providing that URL. You are welcome to go out there and read it. They're already making suggestions about how 2030 should be done. One of the most interesting suggestions being submitted to conduct this is to make it not a household survey. You know, the way the census has been done traditionally is they count all the houses and then all the people in the houses. So it's really a survey of houses. But what if you made it a person survey? And so this ought to be an interesting methodology question. And I don't know that they'll adopt it for 2030, but there are already some suggestions out there. And I actually highly recommend that if you are really interested in making 2030 a better census, that you go read this document. And then as federal registers come out, because this will be the basis of what they're going to be asking comments for public comments on, you weigh in on this. All right, Pauline, this will be you in a second, but I want to talk a little bit about partnerships and how the Census Bureau gets information from us in the states, and then uses that information as they run through their programs. One of the big ones, of course, is the partnership programs that are actual census employees, the data dissemination specialists and the census partnership specialists, which are hired during the decennial census to run the complete count or to assist complete count committees. Annually or every year, governor liaison. So every time you have a new governor, the Census Bureau will reach out to the governor and ask for them to appoint a governor's liaison. Also annually, programs that run are the Federal State Cooperative for Population Estimates, and that would be Robert Radigan and his group over at Geospatial Population Estimates here in New Mexico. There's also a program called the Census Information Centers. The only one that we have in New Mexico is the Navajo Nation Census Information Center. And then there's the state data center program. So the governor liaison, the state data centers, the CICs, the FSCPs, we actually are not federal government employees. We are employees. I work at UNM. Ryan is with Economic Development Department. We actually have other jobs. So these 4 programs that allow the state to give information to the Census Bureau are really volunteer programs. And are very poorly funded. Between decennial censuses, it was my experience that I didn't know who my governor's liaison was to the Census Bureau for at least 6 out of the 10 years that I've been involved in the state data center program, which leads me to believe that a lot of governors don't put the census as important until you have a decennial census coming up, which leaves the other 3 programs are the programs that between the data dissemination specialists and state are really the programs that could be used to keep governments, those top elected officials and people knowing what the Census Bureau is doing and how important the data is for us. And I know, Pauline, you wanted to say a few things here.
Well, thank you, Susan. First of all, I wanted to say, as always, it's a pleasure to be in any part of the New Mexico State Data Users Conference. As the State Data Center of New Mexico, I have to say we always consider it one of the best in our region of our 12 states. So kudos again for a great conference as usual, and that you were able to pivot to virtual and still make it happen so successfully. So thank you for that, Susan.
I paid Pauline for it.
What's that?
I said I paid you for that, right?
Yes, the cookies will come later. Or red chili, I need red chili. But I just wanted to state just some response rates as far as, what just happened is the 2020 census. So the national self-response rate was 67%. The projected self-response rate was 65.6. So we actually did better nationally. The response rate in 2010 for the nation was 66.5. Before I go further, I just wanted to say, I know you New Mexicans are wondering, well, how did we finally do? Well, as a self-response rate, it was 58.7% in New Mexico. And then in 2010, it was 60%. So New Mexico did not fare as well as the nation did as far as the comparison and they were 48th in the nation as far as for their self-response rates, which I want to point out that there's other states that were rural, like Mississippi, like Maine, that were around the same kind of self-response rates as New Mexico. So it is what it is, and it's always been a challenge in New Mexico. I will say that for the nation, how do people respond? As everyone knows, this was the first nationwide census available online. And I have to tell you, it was so important to have technology and the internet as part of this census this time around, because I don't know how we would have done it without it. Because the most favorite way to respond to the census was through internet. And of the 67% that did the national self-response rate, and I do have slides for this, but I just throwing these numbers out, the internet was the easiest and preferred, and it was 79.86%. The second most popular was mailed, that was 18.3, and the least favorite, but still people responded by phone, was 1.85. What was an amazing story that kind of gets lost in all the political buzz around the 2020 census was we had no downtime. We had no downtime from March to October at all. If you wanted to get up at 12 midnight to do your census, you could, or at 1 in the morning, whatever, or 5 in the morning. And then I also wanted to say that we did not have any data breaches. And the average response time for someone to get on the internet was about 9 minutes. So unfortunately, because of all the other these kinds of data are not being, because they're just not sexy enough, I guess. But I'm proud to say that having the census on the internet was a success, and it saved us. It saved the nation for us being able to respond. And this was the first time also that if an enumerator came to your door and you didn't want them to come back, you could still go on the internet and you would be counted in your state self-response rates. For New Mexico, the most popular New Mexicans responded by the internet, 44.8% of the 58.7%, and phone and mail were 13.9%. I did want to mention about non-response follow-up. There was a lot of confusion as to self-response, which is if you responded yourself by mail, by internet, or by phone, and if you didn't, you fell into the non-response workload. So that was 33% of US households. And then people very worried about, well, since we ended October 15th, and unfortunately it was by a Supreme Court ruling, did we get it done? So in 2020, 64 million addresses were counted in a 68-day period. In 2010, 47.2 million addresses were counted in a 69-day period. So it was about the same. The other thing too is when we didn't find you at your home after coming, we were able to do proxy, proxy is what we've always used in any of the censuses. And as of October 16th, about 24.1% of the non-response follow-up was done by proxy. We have projected about 23.8, so we're right. Well, no, not projected, but 23.8 was the measure in 2010, so it's about the same. And then for the first time, we used administrative records. And administrative records and the Census Bureau has set access to these, which would be anywhere from IRS record, Medicaid, Medicare, and of what we had projected to use of the workload, non-response follow-up was 22.5, and we actually ended up only having to do 13.9. So all in all, there was heroic efforts by New Mexicans all over the place, enumerating New Mexicans, and we had wonderful operations offices in Las Cruces, based in Las Cruces and Albuquerque, and enumerators. We had to pivot from our 2 ACO offices and the 50 ACO offices, area census offices. In March, we had not expected it, and we had to order millions of PPE. We had to retrain our enumerators and then of course, as you all know, update leave was delayed, as well as our counting the homeless was moved from March to September. So I have to say that the community organizations, the leadership for the state CCC, all the efforts in New Mexico, and our operations, our enumerators, as well as our partnership specialists, which I will say Lewis Head, who's on this call, was one. I can't say enough that how impressed I was with all the challenges we had. I mean, I had partnership specialists in 100 degrees weather in Las Cruces, being out there in food drives, trying to get people to be enumerated. And I know that the governor and there was foundations that gave money. So all of this, I mean, I don't know what would have happened had we not had all this outreach and engagement by the counties and the state and the governor. So kudos to New Mexico. I know that it wasn't a perfect process. It never is. I was in 2010 in New Mexico, and there's also stories there. But I do want to say thank you for all your work. And the work has only begun because now we have to look at apportionment, which I know you saw in the news that there have been some anomalies. And so we'll look to see how we're trying to meet our deadlines as close as possible. But we stay committed because we want to have a statistically correct census and census numbers to you, our public and customers. That's it.
Thank you, Pauline. That would, can you send me a slide with those stats that you did for the
Sure,
non-response?
I was gonna do it before, but I thought that you've been inundated this week, so I figured I would do it after you come back from your break.
Yeah, about that. So, with all of what we've just talked about and kind of formed a discussion, I actually would like to open up. I think we have like 28 people here, and I'm going to take some notes. I'm not sure how this is going to work, but I just wanted to first, talk to you. I saw coming into 2020, there were funding cuts at the Census Bureau, 2016, 2017, that directly led to the cancellation of some tests, but also slowed down the ramp up of hiring for the 2020 census. That impacted how many people we actually had on the ground doing the census and taking census in New Mexico. And that's not even before you added COVID-19, which then impacted actual, how many people were available to be out there being census takers. The other thing that really impacted was the Census Bureau giving out direction on what their marketing was going to be, their materials, and that those funding cuts in 2016 and 2017 really put the Census Bureau late on their schedule, whether or not they'll admit that. So Pauline, you don't have to comment on that at all. But from my point of view, what I saw was our direction and our information that we were receiving as state data centers was late and not as timely as it could have been. And I think that really led to a late complete count committee formation at the state level. And then obviously, those things that were in the news that I think of as very political, the citizenship question, and something that none of us could adapt to or we're still working with is COVID-19. So I don't know that when you wrap all those things up that hit in 2020, I'm amazed. We had a self-response rate that was 58%. That's pretty darn good, I think. I think it could have been worse. But, that's my take. And I'd actually kind of like to open it up and let those of you in the affiliates and those of you who have joined us who are not part of the affiliates, give me some feedback on what other things that you saw happen that really impacted 2020 in your view. And I'm going to stop sharing for a bit so that I can look at people on the chat and stuff.
You could also ask your questions in the chat section as well, and I'll read them off.
Yep.
And I'm kind of where I'm at with this is I'm going to take some notes. If you guys have of things that you saw that happened that were you thought more important than what I've brought up.
Hi, Susan. This is Kendra.
Go for it.
Oh, should I?
Yes.
No, I just want to say that I think that you're right. Like there was a lot of last minute rallying that proved to be really, really fruitful. I think there was some strong leadership. I think Robert Radigan did an amazing job. And then the team that kind of coalesced around that at the state to create that complete count committee and really get that word out. And I love I think one of the highlights was the collaboration between public and private folks and nonprofits, and really everybody getting behind the same message and understanding how important it was. I know that the Center for Civic Policy, if I have that right, was very active in really getting out the message and being that trusted voices component that's so important to help people understand how important it was and kind of combat that message about the citizen question that I was really concerned. And I think a lot of people were really concerned we're going to turn people off to responding. So I think that was definitely a success story. Yeah, I would agree with you wholeheartedly.
So what I hear there is that those private nonprofit partnerships that came in were very valuable for 2020.
Yes, yes. And I think that well, okay, so it was a combination of the collaboration across, private, public, educational sector, and then also some strong leadership, which I don't know, that there's always been. And I think it was huge that people really stepped up and said, if nobody else is going to do this, then I am. Like, it was really impactful.
And I don't see Paige Best, but I'm just going to give her a call out because her emails coming out and her keeping the statewide complete count committee just informed was fabulous. Go ahead, Lewis. You look like you have something to say.
Yeah, I just wonder what it's going to be. I could say a lot of things, and unlike Pauline, I no longer work for the Bureau, so I can say whatever I want. No,
Not really.
you guys hear that? Yeah, Pauline was my super at the end, and it was great. And I just want to say, I mean, first of all, I mean, in terms of coming into this position, I came into it with some experience working on the census from a position outside of the Bureau. I'd never worked for the federal government, never worked for the Census Bureau. So I brought into this, though, about 40 years almost of experience of doing grassroots organizing or working with grassroots organizations here in New Mexico and in other regions, including 10 years ago, a 3-state partnership that had to do with census and redistricting work. So like for me, it was almost like a no-brainer in terms of applying for one of these positions, because I saw the positioning that it would give me to do a lot of work. And one thing I will say, and this goes to the point of the need for more ongoing engagement with the census at a lot of different levels. We got activist nonprofits that say they're about civic engagement. What they're about is electoral participation. And frankly, I don't think a lot of them would have gotten involved with the census if you hadn't had national philanthropy putting money on the table. And that's a conversation, a follow-up conversation I'm having with people, which it kind of looks at kind of the state of things in terms of the work that goes on these days and how much that is conditioned by what kind of resources are made available nationally. But at the same time, it was really good because it did get people activated, right? But I think we have to go beyond that, both in terms of being able to look at the census strategically, and for organizations to be able to couch it as part of their work, looking at where they're going strategically and what their vision is. And I know it's challenging to have a vision these days that's beyond the hood of your car. I'm aware of that, but we got to get a lot better at that. But that I just saw a lot of different things play out related to that. I cut 2 ways on the census. New Mexico's always been very challenged in terms of getting a good count, right? And that was something that was drilled into us from my first day on the job, at least in terms of the team I was on, and the need to really make a big push, and half of me says, the geekier side of me says, yeah, it is possible to technologically, et cetera, put a dent in this to the point where it goes beyond the results we've been able to see over the past few decades. The other side of me says, can you in fact get a real accurate census count in areas that have extreme structural inequality like we have in New Mexico? And I think that's something that everybody kind of knows about, but then it gets taken off the table a lot in conversations. But we have to look at that history, and it's a serious question, and the two, I think, in the end go hand in hand. And it's ironic because we need the resources that census data help provide, for addressing issues of structural inequality in New Mexico. But there's a lot of stuff I could say. One of the things I am doing right now is, along with Amber Carrillo and a couple other former co-workers, Amber, I've known for a number of years, and she came out of a lot of work with indigenous communities, of course. She's from Laguna, and she ended up becoming a partnership specialist. Oh, the other thing I meant to say that got me into this was that I would hope that organizations on the ground think about the census in terms of partnership positions, because partnership could really use people with organizing experience in it. I think the tendency, left to its own devices, the Bureau will tend to look at the top of institutions or the top of organizations and make relationships there, when what you really need to get to are those people ultimately that are going to have the most in terms of high touch relationships with the very people that are undercounted, right? And I saw a big gulf in certain cases, not in all cases, but between the activist nonprofits on one hand, who do a lot of advocacy work and that sort of thing, and organizations I ended up really focusing most of my time on, which were schools, especially community schools, Title I schools, service providers, healthcare providers, especially ones that are using community health workers, folks that are really on the ground. Those are the people I really focused on getting to, and I'm glad I did in a whole lot of cases. But I think with some of the activist nonprofits, just to lift them up, the immigrant rights organizations here in New Mexico did yeoman's work on this stuff, and I think there is a lot that's owed to them. Of course, I know in the case of Somos and Pueblo Unido up in Santa Fe, that they had done work on the census before. So it's something where they had a certain idea of what they were walking into. But there's a lot to be said. But right now, we are doing some follow-up conversations with people. And one thing on the table is the same thing I said in almost every presentation I gave, which is don't wait until the last number of the year is 8 or 9 to start thinking about the census. And actually, it's kind of fortuitous that there's already room, or soon to be room, for a lot of commentary, because it is fresh on people's minds, because we're going to lose, people's attention span over time. I've done a lot of work with an organization in Mississippi that probably developed one of the best grassroots ground games around the census going back to the late 80s up until about 10 years ago. And they couldn't keep their people focused on board over 10 years. And they were doing amazing grassroots organizing work, redistricting work, all this stuff as part of this package, but they really had to go back and reinvent the wheel, every 7, 8, 9 years, that kind of thing. So I don't know if you can get beyond that or not. I'd love to think that you could, though. And I do know one thing, that here in New Mexico, people did learn. They know a hell of a lot more. People that are potentially important to this process know a hell of a lot more about the census now than they did a year and a half, 2 years ago. So that's good. And that's reflective of the work a lot of us did, both from inside the Bureau and outside of the Bureau. So it was a tremendous experience.
Louis, thanks for sharing that with us, because I know being in part of partnership that was, and on the ground, you have a different view than I do, being the data geek I am. Does anybody else have something they want to bring up and comment? If you saw anything or you heard anything you want to respond to, please feel free to unmute and share.
I'll ask a follow-up if you don't mind, Susan.
Go ahead.
Louis, you had mentioned more ongoing engagement at the local level. Is that something you think, obviously, you had talked about kind of the federal government and the partnership positions taking place, more strategically placed, more than, but is there something that you think that the state data center could do or request to do to keep that ongoing engagement going, not just in years 8 and 9, but through 1 through 7, basically?
I think it's something that where the data center could engage in some kind of partnership with others in the community, and I think it would be good to look at what kind of sectors are important and see, is it, you got to raise the question, is it possible to keep some kind of crew together, on some kind of basis over time, without recognizing so many other things that people have in their lives, right? But I think, yeah, I mean, I've already talked with Susan a little bit about there's a certain amount of interest. I think it really has to be pushed. Oops, sorry. There's a certain amount of interest has to be pushed in terms in the Southeast Heights in the International District, where there are folks over there that are actually looking at performance or delivery of goods and services, right? Based on census numbers and based on the level of census response, and seeing if there's some kind of tracking that could take place as part of an ongoing community education and engagement project. It isn't there. It's an idea that people came up with in the organizing committee, the complete count committee that came together in that part of town, right, in Albuquerque, which would be a cool little project to engage in. That might be something that could be modeled, you know, by others, no? But I think that it would be good to see about bringing together a few key people from certain sectors that can come together and actually provide some kind of mechanism for greater input, or help provoke a greater amount of input amongst those that are most affected by the census and the outcomes of the census. And I'd be interested in talking more about that.
Mhm.
Obviously, I'm already talking about it. So
We're just glad to give you this forum. but it does kind of help us. I'm going to share my desktop again for a second and just wait. No, don't do that, Susan. Just you know, these were some of my thoughts that I put together prior to bringing this to the group on how to prepare and participate in 2030. And I think you brought up an important thing that I was thinking about, but not quite in the same terms you were, is reaching out to those complete count committees that have had formed for 2020. And maybe especially those areas where they were very active, and maybe engaging those communities now through the decade instead of just the year and a half prior to the count might be a good idea, because they need the data. You know, let's be honest, I get calls from people in the international district all the time saying, what is the median household income? What are the race components of the people in my neighborhood? How do I certainly had a neighborhood association reach out to me and say, I see these people raising their kids and they don't have jobs. How can I improve job outlook in our area? I hadn't thought of that directly, but having you speak up, I think that that's something I'd like to put on this slide now, thinking that it's this between the decennial census participation that we need to encourage. All right, anybody else out there, you are welcome to speak up.
We have a comment from Pauline wanting to talk about the state data center.
Go ahead.
Pauline, you are muted.
What I wanted to mention is exactly kind of ditto what Susan said. I mean, I hear a lot of people saying going forward to 2030, and that's important. But I think to really get people to participate in the PSAP or any of the geographical programs, you know, I love your state data users conference, because it, you know, there's other states that do it from like, oh, we're going to give you a report, but you guys do data users. I think that if there's anything that you guys can facilitate as a state data and as affiliates, is to show the importance of the data. I cannot stress enough how lacking it is to have information sessions for tribal nations. I mean, USDA in New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas all told me that rural communities and tribal nations do not get their funding because they don't ask for it and they don't know how to use ACS data. So, and also our staff using PSAP, they hit their heads on the walls trying to get tribal leaders to participate in PSAP. So if we can stress in between the decennials how important data is to getting the dollars you need for your community and how to work with it and how to understand, if there's anything that's so important, Susan, is getting that understanding of our tables, because I don't care if we have data.census.gov, we still need help in really informing tribes, communities, how to use our data to tell their story. That I cannot say is so important. And of course, I know I've done data training for a long, long time, but it's because through my experience, I have seen that. And so, and also with cities, they need to get their CDBG, HUD, all of these, even United Way relies on data. So the more you guys can segue into understanding the importance of data, and participating in geographic programs and other things that aren't as sexy like PSAP, it's so important. I cannot stress that enough.
So we're almost to my last slide. I'm going to add to this slide because I think complete count committees, now that I've had that feedback both from Lewis and Pauline, maybe we need to bring them somehow into being part of the State Data Center affiliate program, or at least I know I try to reach out to everybody and get everybody I can to come to the Data Users Conference. Maybe I need to do some more reach out that's a little bit. There are a couple of things I'd like to see for 2030, the state funding being available a little bit earlier, because late in 2020, you know, August and September, I saw the real good push where we were finally able to actually being spending the dollars for the complete count committees. If that money is available a little bit earlier, I think those complete count committees can do a better job. But certainly we saw that last 6-week push was phenomenal. My other issue is always there's that letter that's sent to the highest elected official. And who is that person, and do they really understand how important census data is to them? And then I think my final thing is to add, maybe we come around some way to keep complete count committees kind of going. Maybe not call them complete count committees, census engagement committees. Does anybody else have any ideas? Please feel free to jump in and share.
See if there's anything in the chat here.
Well, one thing that would be good to do is just have some kind of something that can convene people, at least people that are interested, maybe 3 years out, something like that from the count, in order to get the census on people's radar institutionally, you know, with different kinds of folks. And you're not going to get 100% of the people you invite. But if you get 20% or 25% or 50%, you're in a lot better shape. Just to get people thinking and get people to, as part of that, to make a commitment to have a conversation inside their organization or their institution or wherever it is they are, right? And these could be people that are in governance, or they could be people in the private sector, you know, civil society. There's a lot of different examples. One crew that I'm continuing to work on a little bit with this is the school board here. I think it's in the school board's interest to keep a better line on the census. Whether they have the capacity to do that is another question. But you see what I'm saying? I mean, something, this would be like a minimal thing, and it could involve participation. I mean, Pauline maybe might have an idea about this, but it could involve participation from the Bureau. Now, I'm thinking more along the lines of community engagement building up for the census. This doesn't necessarily respond to what Pauline and Susan, you've raised regarding the need for response to geography programs and PISA, et cetera, right? That doesn't answer those questions. And those are really important questions. And I think they require a little bit different approaches. Maybe there could be a comprehensive way of looking at this. I don't know though. That's a project all by itself. That turns into a project.
Okay, so before we log off, I want to recognize a lot of the people who are on the call who have not spoken up today and say thank you, because I know you have all put a lot of work in to working on the 2020 census and on census issues. If nothing else, you've all listened to my emails throughout the year and not stopped taking my emails, right? I'm going to actually ask everybody. I'm going to go through the people who are on the participants list here and ask you all to unmute and tell us who you're with, and what is your biggest hope for 2020 census data. And just to start that, this is Susan Reagan. I work at UNM Bureau of Business and Economic Research, and my biggest hope for the 2020 census data that we get is that we don't have a question of this data is bad data, but we have the question of this is good data and it's going to help us fund our next water project. Ryan, you get to go next.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Eustace. I'm an economist for the Economic Development Department for the state of New Mexico. I'm also your state data center lead. I put my email in the chat box. One of the things that from 2020 that I want to learn from and improve on is understand how 2020 was done at the state level through the state complete count committees. We have a survey out through through the membership of those subcommittees, so we can see kind of the makeup, see where we can improve. But one of the things I really want to stress is trying to be a better state data center, especially a better data center lead. If there's information, if there's things you'd like to see, products or resources that you think the state data center should apply for through legislation, so we can do a better job. That's absolutely something I'm really hoping to take from this 2020. And I think Pauline hit it right on the head when she was talking about self-response rates and how New Mexico loves, or the United States loves to do it through the internet, but New Mexico has internet issues. So I think there's a lot of different facets that we can learn from 2020 that we can kind of apply going forward. And as the state data center lead and a person who does a lot of work in legislation, I would love to get feedback from the group and the affiliates and the data users on ways to improve what we're providing and what we're doing on a regular basis.
So I'm just going to call people out as I see them in my participants list. Saroon, why don't you unmute and tell us?
Hey everyone, I'm Saroon Luitel. I work as a programmer at the Bureau of Business and Economic Research. Now for this census, I'm really excited so this was my first census here in the United States, so I got counted on that part. So that was exciting to fill out the form and to be a part of this country in that way. And also I'm looking forward to the way the data comes out and the amazing dashboards and all the other things I get to work on as a part of my job. So I'm more along the side of what can I do with those data in terms of a technical side, that being my job. So that's the side I'm looking forward to.
Thank you. Bianca.
Hi, Susan. Hi, everybody. My name is Bianca Borg. I'm with Mr. COG. I'm actually with the Mid-Region Metropolitan Planning Organization. I just finished my first year there, and I've recently taken over as the census liaison for my office. I think for us, we just had our Metropolitan Transportation Plan approved in 2020. And we were working with 2010 data. So it'll be exciting with our update in 2025 that will be a little bit more in the middle. So we'll have maybe hopefully some better numbers. We'll see what happens. But yeah, it's funny. My first data user conference was last year, and it was like this big anticipation for, the 2020 census. And I think this has just been such a struggle. But I think, like everyone's been saying, that it's really amazing what was pulled off with all of the challenges that there were. So kudos to everyone that made that happen.
Thank you. Carrie House.
Hi, everybody. I'm with Northwest New Mexico Council of Governments, and I've been thrown into the census a couple of years ago, participating in LUCA and doing PSAP for our Northwest region and the Complete Count Committee. So I just hope we have like user-friendly data and infographics to help with CDB and ICIP and SEDS and tribes and all of that. So our region has checkerboard area of the Navajo Nation. So it was kind of difficult at times to communicate with various tribes, actually. Sometimes they're not so great on communication, and sometimes they lead me to other people trying to pass the buck, and I didn't really get anywhere. So in some cases, I have to take the initiative to create CDPs in our region. So I hope the census accepts all of my boundaries for those areas. It was a very extensive project for just me alone working on all of these aspects. So anyway, I'm always asking for help and looking for data for our area. So if you have any leads or ideas, I would appreciate it.
Thank you for your hard work, Carrie, too, because I know that wasn't easy. Hey, David Irvin.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm David Irvin. I'm with New Mexico State University. I'm in the library there as a government documents librarian and business librarian. So I'm just excited, primarily this comes up in my role in the classroom, actually. So when we have classes with students coming in, I can help teach the other reference staff about the data tools that are out. So I'm excited to see the data and to see how it can be applicable in research, student research primarily. Thanks.
Thank you.
I always enjoy this.
Thank you, David. Debbie Sue.
Hi, I'm Debbie, and I'm with the University of New Mexico. I'm a finance faculty, so I'm working with more finance-related research. And I was wondering that because that so far, I don't think that there is a lot of like saving information from individual households. And I'm kind of interested in the saving patterns, or how does it affect the household savings. It seems that we focus a lot about consumption, but actually we need to promote more about the saving concept. So it would be nice to have that type of information. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Santa Falcone. All right, I don't hear Santa, so we'll try Henry Moon. And as I said yesterday, as I was signing off, this is where we find out that people sort of float in and out and aren't actually at their desk all that often. Jacob Vigil.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jacob V. Hill. I'm a research and policy analyst at New Mexico Voices for Children. We're really excited to get the decennial data. A lot of our work really comes from and depends on the census. So having solid, up-to-date data that can tell us about child well-being, disaggregated by race, is really important. And so we're hopeful that it will be robust data with really sort of user-friendly way to access it, and so that we can continue to use that in our advocacy for policies that will help working families and children.
Thanks for all the work you do too, Jacob. We love your data stuff. How about Jasmine Hendrickson? All right, Louis, you can introduce yourself again if you want.
Well, hi, I'm Louis Head, and I'm a civilian these days. I work for the Bureau for about a year and a half in the partnership division. And now I'm figuring out what I'm going to do next. And it's actually been kind of luxurious, taking a little bit of time off, although this hasn't been this is one of our weirdest moments in history, I think. So in terms of, figuring out what the hell happens next. But yeah, I'm just interested in seeing the results in terms of the data that comes out of this, starting with the redistricting data and the application of such, and how that plays out in the coming year, but how the other data is then folded into what is released publicly and its utility. So, and a few other things I already alluded to, I think.
Okay, thanks. Hey, Omar.
Hey, my name is Omar Solis. I am a researcher at the Bureau of Business Economic Research. I work with Saroon and Susan. Expectations, I really can't say what expectations is, but what I really need to do, and I'm kind of embarrassed that I haven't already, is just go through all the data, figure out what everything is. It's an excellent source that I don't really use a whole lot doing economic impacts. But I think it's a data source that I really should be more familiar with, and I think it'll keep me from needing to send Susan an email every week. Hey, how do I get this? This is available. So,
And I don't. That's okay. I don't mind the email every week.
Omar, I've been doing it for 3 years, and I still email Susan all the time.
Wonderful. That's good to hear. I'm happy to hear that.
Well, I'm going to say thank you all for participating this afternoon. It's been a good discussion. And for those of you who want, I'm going to be doing sort of a networking discussion at 3:30, and that'll be the last session of the Data Users Conference. And then keep an eye out. I'll be sending out the final email that'll ask for you guys to fill out our exit survey, but also note that we're working on getting all of the recordings processed and then put up on the website, on our YouTube website. So I'll send those links out. And if you missed anything, you can go capture those. So thanks for participating today.